Good morning. I'm George Willey. Welcome to The Other Side. In this show, we bring guests who are thought leaders. We ask them to consider positions different from their own. Our pursuit is to learn whether we are driven by reason or by passion, by self-interest or charity, or even enlightened self-interest. We ask our guests to look at the other side. Today you will see an interview with former Defense Secretary Robert Gates by Farah Kilidar. Farah is the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Houston. She's a British-trained lawyer with a keen eye on the world stage. You will see Farah in a skillful fencing game with the Secretary. Here is a man who had served under almost all presidents since Reagan, led the CIA, headed universities, being gently grilled on matters over which he had enormous influence, and yet not always willing to open the trapdoor. Farah persists, and what unfolds is a fascinating look at a man who may have set our security and intelligence agenda for many years behind closed gates. Here's Farah.
From a historical standpoint, the two most significant presidents I served were first President Bush and President Reagan. President Reagan, after people forget, everyone talks about how terrible things are right now and so on, and people forget how tough things were in the late 1970s. Inflation is at nearly 20%, interest rates are 17 or 18%, the economy's in the tank, the Soviets have just invaded Afghanistan, we've just lost the war in Vietnam. It was pretty bleak. And here comes Ronald Reagan, full of optimism about the American future and how to rebuild the American economy and rebuild the American military. And he had a vision for the country that I think was extraordinary. And then you had George H.W. Bush and managing the end of the Cold War. And as I have often said, the end of the Cold War was to phrase it another way, there is no precedent in history for the collapse of a major empire without a major war.
Right.
Until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I believe someday the first President Bush will get the credit he deserves for managing that. And a feeling in 1992, 1993, that the country was not only headed in the right direction, but that we basically had an unquestioned leadership role in the entire world.
Right. And one of the things you speak of in your book on President Ronald Reagan, that one of the most things you admired about him is his optimism, both about the U.S. and the future. Whilst the current contenders, you have been quoted to say, sound like, quote unquote, we're going down the drain. We can't help but see a campaign of fear, a campaign advocating for very unusual prescriptions to keep America safe, be it carpet bombing countries or killing ISIS family members or banning Muslims from entering the U.S. A campaign where establishment figures such as Jeb Bush have really had trouble getting traction. As a keen observer of foreign policy, especially from the perspective of various regions, I can't help but know that the U.S., specifically U.S. foreign policy, and specifically as it pertains to the Middle East, has been in a reactionary position, especially since 9/11. The U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East has operated from a place of fear, and one would argue that history has shown us time and time again that when leaders make decisions from a place of fear, there are some drastic consequences. What would you say to that?
I think that we have tried to deal with problems in the Middle East, and really by the Middle East I mean from Tunisia to Pakistan, as they have cropped up and as we have had to deal with them. 9/11 obviously required a response to the homeland of Al-Qaeda, but we have seen developments all over the region that are troubling. And my concern is that I believe we face a generation of conflict and turmoil and violence in the Middle East as a whole. And I think there are 4 major conflicts going on simultaneously. The first is Shia Islam led by Iran versus Sunni Islam led by Saudi Arabia. Second, reformers versus authoritarians. Third, secularists versus Islamists. And fourth, and perhaps most dangerous, question of whether artificially created countries with historically adversarial ethnic, tribal, and religious groups, specifically Libya, Syria, and Iraq, can hold together, or whether they will fracture as Yugoslavia did in the early 1990s. I'm not optimistic, but the result is we have an entire region in turmoil, and I don't believe either party, anybody in either party, is putting forward a strategy that, like our strategy of containment toward the Soviet Union, could survive multiple presidencies and with bipartisan support in how the United States responds to this region of turmoil over the long term. And so we are in largely a reactive mode. And until you can back away and say, this is going to be this way for a quarter of a century, how do we shape our policy so, first of all, we can pursue a consistent policy no matter who's president or who controls the Congress, and so we can begin to get out in front of some of these developments. So I think that's a challenge.
You have been quoted recently this week as saying that some of those candidates, Republican candidates' grasp of national security issues would, quote unquote, embarrass a middle schooler. What leadership traits would you say are lacking in those candidates, and are those traits that can be learned?
Well, I think that there are some concerns that I have with a number of the candidates. I think both on the Democratic Party side, and also at least among the front runners on the Republican side, and that is that they are either making threats or promises that, in my view, are unattainable, unachievable, unaffordable, or in some cases unconstitutional. Maybe it's just in the vein of modern politics, but it would be nice to hear candidates saying, these are complex problems, and what we need is a president who can represent all Americans and figure out how to make forward progress on a lot of the big problems that beset our country, from the national debt to federal deficits to education, immigration, and so on. And that any enduring policy is going to have support on both sides of the aisle. And that would be a realistic, that's sort of Churchillian. In terms of being honest with the American people about the nature of the problems that we face, instead of dumbing down answers in the belief that a simplistic answer will win support. That's not leadership, in my view. That's followership. I found when I was president of Texas A&M and in the military and the various places that I've led, I have found that if you set and even in the Boy Scouts, if you set the bar high, people tend to rise to the bar. Absolutely. If you set the bar low, that's where they will go. And the purpose of a leader is to set the bar high, to convey the notion of the American people of respect for their intelligence and that they understand that the world's eyes. Franklin D. Roosevelt said one of the greatest responsibilities of a leader is to educate. I don't think that any of the front runners in either party right now are spending much time on educating.
Just scary, to say the least. And sticking with the front runners of the Republican Party, and speaking of one of the two presidents you referred to earlier, former President George H.W. Bush. We at the Council had the pleasure of the President and Mrs. Bush joining us at one of our events when we hosted John Meacham, who was speaking about his most recent book about the President. Reading the book, one can't help but feel that the Republican Party of Reagan and Bush Sr. is a thing of the past. That perhaps the Republicans need to revise or reassess their priorities and what they stand for. Would you agree with that? And if so, do you see that happening prior to the next presidential elections?
I think both parties go through cycles, and they go through periods of division and difficulty. The Democrats had their turn in the 1980s. Right. The Republicans are having their turn now. And maybe the Democrats to a certain extent. The philosophical differences, I think, between Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton are pretty substantial. But I don't see any of these things as irreversible. That's why I say I think they're cyclical. And everybody thought that in 1976, after President Ford lost the election and we just lost the war in Vietnam, that the Democrats would control the government for a long time to come. And then Ronald Reagan comes along. So I'm, like him, I'm an optimist, and I think that there will be leaders for the Republican Party that perhaps in this election cycle, perhaps in the next one, convey the same kind of optimism that Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush had, that will once again propel the party. The party's doing very well in Congress and very well in the state level.
Well, it depends how you
So it's
define
really all about the presidency, and the
Right.
question is whether one of the current candidates grows into a bigger persona and a more optimistic leader, or whether we have to wait a while.
And I agree with you. It is cyclical, and other forms of leadership tends to really be a pendulum shift. But yet, whilst we're waiting for that pendulum to shift and hopefully at some point settle somewhere in the middle, countries are made and broken, and hundreds of thousands of people are dead. So the impact a U.S. president has is huge. It's one of the things that we try and convey to our students, the importance of voting, the power a U.S. citizen has, and the recognition that this is not just about your town, your community, your city, your state, your country. This is about the world. And the problem is some of those damages, some of those consequences as a result of rash decisions, or whichever way you want to call it, there's no going back. Places have been wiped out. Parts of Iraq and Syria have been wiped out, and historical parts have been wiped out. There's no going back.
First of all, I think it's important to understand that some of these situations are beyond the ability of the United States to sort through or to put on a positive path. What's going on in the Middle East right now, some people will argue that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was behind all of this. I don't believe that. Right. There's a lot going on in the Middle East. I talked about these 4 different conflicts. I think in some respects we exaggerate our ability to control events or to shape events, and in fact, I think that that sort of gets into the debate about where is the line between strong American international leadership stop and being world policemen start.
Right.
So, as I wrote in a previous book, the United States, even our military, the strongest and best in the world, can't solve every oppression, every crisis, every difficult situation that comes up around the world, and even every genocide. And so we have to determine, first of all, what are our interests?
Right.
What are the interests of the American people and our country? And then look at these situations in that framework, and where is it important for us to commit resources, and not just military resources, and where should we stand aside?
We'll be right back with Farah and Secretary Gates. But first, we invite you to visit one of our sponsors, Asia Society Texas Center in Houston's Museum District. See their latest exhibition, Drawn from Nature, for free until February 21st. Be sure to mention that you saw the ad on the other side.
On The Other Side, we interview a variety of people and seek to examine their beliefs, their opinions, and their passions. Then we invite them to come with us to the other side and look at the antithesis of their views. What comes out is an in-depth conversation without the vitriol of the talk shows, but a cerebral engaging of ideas you will not find anywhere else. Come join us on alternate Saturdays at 8:30 a.m. on this channel. If you'd like to recommend a guest for The Other Side, contact us at the email address on the screen.
I think what Mr. Trump and Senator Sanders are tapping into is a lot of frustration on the part of many Americans that our elected leaders at the national level have not had a clear view of where we need to go as a country, and the polarization and the paralysis, the failure to make any progress on any major issue, and the sense that so many of the politicians at the federal level especially are self-dealing or self-serving.
Right.
And they're really more about getting reelected than doing the right thing for the American people. And until that elected class can make a contrary argument by showing progress and showing they can get things done, I think that this big current in contemporary American politics will continue.
Well, thank you for talking about that, because you, as you mentioned your earlier book, your memoir, Duty, you talked quite a bit about that. And you also gave us a glimpse of a composed general, yet concealing really strong emotions all along. In fact, even in this book, you speak of the importance of having passion in your leadership. You wrote then that you began telling troops in the war zones and elsewhere that I felt a sense of responsibility for them, as if they were my own sons and daughters. As a result, during your time with the Obama administration, you often took, one would argue, you often took positions with a primary concern for protecting the troops. You, in fact, even stated in your memoir that your obsession to protect the troops was clouding your judgment and diminishing your usefulness to the president. Those words really struck a chord with me. Watching the debate over and over, the troop surge in Iraq or the withdrawal of troops from Iraq, I couldn't help but feel that we all see the world and prioritize our strategic goals from our prism. So watching the debates from my prism, I would be looking at the loss of innocent lives or the risk of a highly fragile nation. As a leader, and specifically as a U.S. leader, a U.S. president, whose actions or inaction, as we were discussing, can make or break nations, how do you maintain that balance? How do you serve your country's interest, as you were saying, whilst also maintaining a very clear perspective and empathy for the other side?
Well, I think, first of all, the greatest presidents in American history have acknowledged that, and sometimes very specifically, that they were not the smartest men in the room. And the best presidents, the greatest ones, Washington, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, in every case surrounded themselves with very independent, tough-minded, candid people who they thought were smarter than they were.
Right.
And they listened to them.
Right.
So the answer to your question really is, no one is smart enough to be able to make those decisions or those determinations about where the line, where the United States should draw a line, or where we ought to do this or that, without the counsel of some very strong people. And I believe there needs to be not only a president who works closely with people, who hires and empowers very strong independent people around him, but also is willing to reach out to members of Congress and to other leaders. And I mean, the key point in leading change, and one of the key points on that in the book is inclusiveness of decision making. The more, whenever I had a big decision to make in defense or CIA or Texas A&M, I tried to consult with the broadest possible range of people, including people that I knew had a totally contrary view of mine, and then to try and make the best possible decision based on getting a lot of advice and a lot of counsel from a lot of people. A leader has to make those decisions, and I have no brief for people who dither over tough decisions, but getting the broadest possible perspective is critical. And the leader who says, I'm the smartest man in the room, I don't need to talk to anybody else, I know what to do, I think is a problem.
Absolutely. And Mr. Secretary, you're about to speak to a room full of about 500 of our members, some students as well as veterans. And one question I can count on getting, especially in light of President Rouhani's recent European tour, is your view on the Iran nuclear deal and the more recent prisoner swap.
Well, I think, first of all, the deal has accomplished several important things. Getting 97, 98% of the enriched uranium out of Iran is important. Dismantling 2/3 of their 19,000, 18,000 centrifuges is important. Having them have to change the reactor at Iraq so that it can't produce plutonium, I think is is important. So those are the good things about the agreement. My concern about the agreement, first of all, was it seemed to me from the outside that we wanted a deal more than they did. And that's never a good position from which to negotiate. Another concern that I have is that as recently as last April, the administration was telling us that they absolutely had to have any time, any place inspections to make sure the Iranians weren't cheating. We gave that up. We also said it was critically important to have the history of Iranian efforts to weaponize their nuclear program. And we gave all of that up. So I think that the deal has some very real shortcomings. It does accomplish certain things. One of the ways it seems to me the president could have mitigated the dangers of the agreement as well as some of the negative reaction would have been to announce in a major public speech simultaneously with the signing of the agreement, here is the aggressive policy we are going to pursue against Iran in this region. This agreement is about nuclear weapons. This is not about our backing away from from opposing Iran. Here is what we're going to do to change our military posture in the Middle East. Here's the additional help we're going to give our friends and allies. Here is the additional intelligence that we're going to share and work together on. A strong position. The irony is, the Ayatollah gave that speech and said, we are not going to let this agreement affect the way we deal with the great Satan at all in this region.
Right.
So I think that there's too much of an undercurrent of hope and belief that the agreement is going to change Iranian behavior over the long term. I think that's unrealistic. So I think we could have had a much more realistic, much more tough-minded rollout of the agreement, if you will.
And I'd like to end with this great city, Houston. So when it comes to international affairs, most people turn to federal agencies and the experts in Washington. But the post-industrial world economy we now find ourselves in is really has given rise to influential global cities like New York, Paris, Tokyo, and Houston. In your view, are there areas that civic and business leaders here in the city of Houston should focus on as priorities for a global city like ours, especially since leaders set the tone?
I think it is important to create an environment in our cities and in our country where people from different cultures and backgrounds feel welcome and comfortable. And so I go back to one of the points in the book, the importance of inclusion, of if there are when there are foreign businessmen and women in town or residing here, trying to integrate them into the life of the community so that you don't have them set apart. You know, the irony is, taking it in a totally different direction than your question, one of the ultimate solutions to dealing with lone wolf ISIS terrorists in the United States is the integration of Muslim communities into our cities and into our society, and having an environment in which imams in mosques and the parents of Muslim young men come forward if they are worried about their children being radicalized, and allowing us to get in front of the threat rather than reacting to it once that's already taken place. And so I think a city, an international city particularly, there are a whole lot of very good reasons to be more inclusive and to work harder to integrate the international community and different nationalities and religious beliefs into the life of the city.
Inclusiveness.
Inclusiveness.
Great ending. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Tune in on our next show when we will take the next guest to the other side.